case, we will wait a few minutes. No one has stepped in yet. This is our last teaching talk for the fall quarter. We'll definitely do another one beginning, I would say, in January. We have Thanksgiving coming up, and we also have the, as we start December, we have final exams, and then we're, of course, closed for a while, so we won't do any more this month due to Thanksgiving, and then also next month being the short one with the holiday. So the next ones will come out in January, either the first week or the second week. I still have to do some room scheduling. And as usual, if you want to watch at home, you can always click on the live cast. I will investigate whether I can maybe get a better stream for this, because I'm seeing a significant delay today. If you like, one of the things you can do is, if you look on your screen right now, you should see a chat since you're on the live of YouTube. And that chat will allow you to type in a comment, a question, anything like that. So if there's something you really want to ask today. The focus of today is passion and emotions, and the role that passion and emotions play in our teaching careers and anything really we do at the college. It's something that we certainly stress with our students, is the idea of having a passion for a subject that you might study, and then using that to motivate yourself, using that to get excited about the field that you're studying, the discipline that you're studying, and so forth. But the topic today was, talk about passion and emotions, but we could certainly talk about any topics in teaching. It's one of the things I think that maybe carries over from our last few conversations. We talked about empathy. We also talked about the challenges of creating responsibility in a classroom. How do you get students to really take initiative and so forth? And for me, when students have passion for a subject, that's a possibility that you can really ignite something there, because they've already got that excitement. Like I'm sure in a math class, because I think math and English are always the two that we say, a lot of people take those classes and they often don't want to be in a math or an English class. They're fearful of that. And so when you have a student who comes to a math class who's excited about it, I think that's golden, I would assume.
Yeah. It's amazing. It's what it is.
Yeah. And Wynn's actually eating her lunch, so I'll just kind of jump in on that a little bit. But
basically, if I have a student, happen to come across a student who's really interested in the material, I try to ask them to let me know what they're interested in.
Sure.
Like math being used for. Are you interested in sports? Are you interested in finance? Get some other interest in them. And then I try to build an example, to show the class around the student's interests, so that I can relate it as much, to their interests, to say, hey, math can be really useful, in this area. Right. To try and show it to them. I mean, that's kind of, where I go with that. I try to, fuel the fire, or feed the fire, so to speak.
Yeah. No, that's a great idea. So, if you're teaching math, you could say, well, you're interested in exercise science, and you need to know a ton of math to understand kinesiology, right? So it's like a building block in really most areas that we can think of in terms of careers or education.
Here's an example of how math can be used in kinesiology.
Yeah.
And then, having taught the class enough times, I'm able, fortunately, to kind of come up with an example on the fly.
Sure. Yeah. And I think that's the case. Hopefully it would be, and sorry if I know there's still some camera issues. I would love to get more of the room in here, but I'm kind of limited with just my camera setup. But yeah, hopefully in any subject we teach. Now, if you're teaching what's called basic skills or foundations, which it's typically English and math, then we always tell them, you need this to be successful in really every single area. I can't think of an area of study that doesn't need some math or English. And so that's why we always say we have all these initiatives of basic skills, and we say you have to get these tracks, these math and English tracks, really in your first year, right? You have to have that foundation.
The question is has been in more recent years is how much of the English and math do you actually need for subsequent studies? And that brings up the whole issue of AB 705.
Right.
So that's kind of actually the math preparation or, supplement companion class models have actually kind of more replaced the basic skills models.
Yeah, very good point. And I think that not just with AB 705, but also we've had a conversation and our CLEMC group, which for those of you out there, it's our College Learning Enrollment Management Council, it's a mouthful. We're going to be looking at the whole slew of degrees and certificates starting on Thursday, and hopefully we'll have some recommendations. I know that a few in the math department have brought forward the issue of, you have these local degrees, shouldn't those local degrees at least be college level math in terms of what they provide to the students? And it seems to me for years we've had this, I don't want to say workaround, but it's almost been like we have two different degrees and one has easier math. And I personally think it's kind of a problem because then we're sending mixed messages about the value of math. And same thing with English, and I don't think it's the case with English though.
So I think the challenge is that, in so many schools, there's so many majors, you really do not need to know, I'd say 90% of the material that was covered in the former basic skills, sequence, which basically is arithmetic through beginning algebra. Once you got past the arithmetic, I would say 90% of the material is not needed for anything other than business, science, technology, and engineering majors. It's called B-STEM. Those are really the only majors where you need to know, algebra. So basically, what's happened, what the problem was is that all these students were taking this basic skills slew of math classes that were a sequence that was 5 long. And they, were dropping out because they were getting, discouraged. And, it's like some people just don't have math brains. I mean, we all have our strengths and weaknesses. But to require so much when really not that much is needed for your field of study. I mean, if you're an engineer and you're saying, I don't like algebra, then maybe you better rethink your major because engineering is going to require that. But if you're an English major or Spanish major, you aren't going to need to know the equation of an ellipse. So that's, and I think, what the argument has been is that, the sending of mixed messages is because students, cover that material in high school, and if they apply directly to a 4-year school, then they, will have had it in high school. But
so it's really on us to figure out, and I think we'll do more of this as we're moving more towards guided pathways, and even the CTE OEI, CDC OEI grant we're working on. We're hoping that we can map out, the future pathways, career or education if someone's transferring or if they're entering the workforce, and figure out, like in this case, how much math they need or how much English they need. It's very important to do that.
And I would say pretty much a safe rule to say is unless it's business or STEM, you really do not need anything other than pre-stats and stats.
I was thinking like psychology, stats would cover it, sociology. I think if you had stats, then you'd be okay.
And pre-stats is a brand new class that we're offering this quarter to be compliant with AB 705.
Right.
Before that, everybody had to go through the whole algebra sequence before entering stats.
Sure. So it's, I think like anything else, as we continue to develop guided pathways, we have a great opportunity to talk to our English and math faculty and say, okay, what foundations do students need? And then there's even opportunities to stress that, like I'm doing right now these promise classes, And we're looking at things very generally and trying to tell students about study skills. And Melanie from our Director of Library Learning Services came in, did a 2-hour talk on doing a research paper, doing research in the library. And if there's a value, we could certainly build in more of this in the Promise class to talk a little bit about math and English and how it's going to be important, or any other foundations out there. Some other foundations could be critical thinking or oral communication, or just the value of doing research or self-expression, whatever those foundations are. We could maybe have more of that built in to our Promise classes in the future, because I think it's really important. I worry a little bit that when the students take your math class or they take an English class, they're not prepared. They're like, well, wait a second, this is really high level, and even though for us it's basic, for them it could be really challenging, particularly when, hey, Damion Estrada just walked in from Wilderness Education, and we have at least 2 people online, Kurt, who teaches music, and we're just having a conversation as Damion walked in about the issue of students having, getting their foundations in math and English here at the college, and sort of overcoming fear about that, because a lot of students, when they take a math or English class, they're petrified, they're afraid to take one of your classes.
So I think the question comes down to is it a necessity issue or is it a philosophical issue? I mean, because the argument has been from the majority of people in the math department is they feel that in order to be, that an AA degree requires well-balanced education. So that you should, because of that, you should be expected to know this algebra stuff. That's really so that's kind of an education philosophy viewpoint. But from the point of necessity, the argument is not there. There's no need for it. They will not need it. They will not need to graph an ellipse to do psychology.
Right.
So
they definitely need the stats.
Yeah, they need the stats, but stats has as a prerequisite very minimal knowledge of algebra.
Okay.
It requires a totally different way of quantitative reasoning.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess trying to again figure out what do students need, but you're right. If it's a I keep getting comments about sitting up front. Okay, but if again we know with different careers or fields that students are going to need certain math or English skills, hopefully we can build those out. Now the philosophical conversation, that's different, and I think sometimes the feeling is when we're experts in our areas, we sometimes think students should have a higher level, either appreciation or knowledge or practice. And that's, I think, kind of a challenge. And I have to say, personally, I've backed away from some of that over the years. If a student takes an anthro social class, I don't expect them, obviously, taking one class to be a professional social scientist, but hopefully they have some appreciation of some of the approaches, particularly critical thinking, looking at information in a critical sense, having media literacy, and just generally looking at society maybe and people in a new way. But the philosophical argument is a hard one, because that is not about student need. It's more like we want more rigor, or we want this framework.
Exactly. It's a totally different argument. So I think, my recommendation is, what is the objective of the guided, pathways in the Quincy? Is it looking at it from the point of student need, or, or rigor, or compromise? And the issue with math is that I don't quite see, and you let me know because I don't know a whole lot about social anthropology, is that there's a lot more disability in math. I mean, students just, for whatever reason, just don't get it. Their brains don't pick up but a certain amount of it, no matter how hard they try. I mean, we're talking about students who try hard. Have you found that to be the case in social or cultural anthropology classes?
The thing that comes up I think in any social science is the moment where a student comes to class, and a lot of this is online, and they're used to talking about issues like if you turn on the news, and even the news has shifted away from like information to pundits talking, right, on different political spectra, the left and the right. So sometimes students are engaging in social media, they're experiencing all this media, they're getting on their phones, little bits on YouTube, whatever media platforms they have, and then they come to a class and we say, well, now it's good that you have perspectives on people and society and politics, but there's a method, there are theories that need to be applied, methodologies that need to be applied to how we talk about people. And that's the challenge, because in a social science, because you're dealing with subjective emotions and politics, and not everything is, the quadratic equation, there's
black and white.
Right? It's kind of black and white. Unless you get into theoretical math, right, or quantum physics, that is actually closer, in my mind, to social science. But the challenge in social science is the student comes into the classroom and they have a foundation, but that foundation, I don't want to say it's faulty, but it's skewed, right? It's like they're focused on people, they're focused on issues, but they might be argumentative and they might say, well, my position's right. And instead we say, well, we try to look at things in a sober way in social science and apply our methods and apply our theories. And you might differ on someone's opinion, but we still want you to look at it as objectively as possible. So for me, that's the biggest challenge. And I often will get a student who comes into a class and they say, I had a student, I don't know why I remember this, was like 19, 20 years ago when I first started teaching here. He was a physics major, and he had written really short papers in a physics class. And like there was one expectation, he wrote a paper in my class, and he didn't get a good grade. I think it was 2 or 3 papers in. He was really upset, and he just kept saying, well, in a physics class, it's about this. And I said to him, well, every discipline has their own approach to writing or to analytical reasoning or to whatever. So the thing I deal with is almost like, it's not a fear. I would say there's an acceptance. I get a lot of students who are like, oh, cool, we can talk about all this fun stuff in this class. But then they get really argumentative, and I'm always redirecting that person. So it's a totally different challenge. They have to present
their arguments in a certain way that's objective.
Yeah.
Not just say I'm right.
Yeah. So that's the biggest challenge. So
it's how to get them to articulate their cases.
Exactly.
In a manner that will meet the standards.
Yeah. Damion, what about? I always think, and maybe it's my stereotype, I said this in our last teaching talk, if you have safety issues, you're set, and you can just tell them, hey, if you don't understand that, you take an avalanche training class and you don't understand what you're doing, someone could die because of your mistakes. So do you find like you have that authority going into it because you can stress safety and awareness and teamwork and that kind of stuff? Or what are some challenges that you deal with in terms of like foundations from the minute a student takes a wilderness studies class or wilderness education leadership class?
Definitely the environment helps with it, because people understand that there's danger involved. But it's also cultivating a classroom, a community classroom, where I'm not the sole responsible person for the safety. Everyone's responsible for their own safety and the safety of others. Really promoting that. I think how it builds that safety net for people.
Sure.
That's part of the wilderness experience, wilderness education, is having that communication and trust between the students, to have them build that, because there's only one of me and another instructor. They're usually, for example, in climbing, they're playing each other, so basically they have to trust someone else with their life, basically.
Yeah.
And so it's really creating the culture of that, a safe environment within a dangerous environment. And giving them the right pedagogy and skills to handle that task. And when it's appropriate. I think for an instructor is understanding when the student is ready to handle that task, setting them up for success.
Yeah, and that's an argument for, like we have really good class sizes here. I would hate to think what it'd be like if you had a class of 70 or something. You couldn't do it. There's a reason we cap. I think in any subject we teach, certainly in math, the hands-on, and social science, because we're asking students to participate with one another. If you have too many students, you can't have a good discussion. And then in wilderness, if you're teaching a technique and you had to watch, and you didn't have TAs or supplemental instructors, and you have to watch all these students, it would be so dangerous if your class was too big. Right?
Yeah, we have cap sizes on our
Definitely
classes
caps, yeah.
because of that. But I think it's just a great selling point for community colleges is the small class size. I went to a university where you'd have 300 kids or students in a class, and you just don't get that personal time with the professors.
Yeah. Kind of connected. I love, Kurt, thanks for all your comments. I love your thing about there. You said it's also about fostering communication. I think it's probably, I know you teach DE, so I'm sure it says in the DE class. And I think communication is such a key point. We struggle with it, I think, always with our students right now with our Promise program. We're trying to figure out, like, we have so many wraparound services. All day today, by the way, if any of your students are listening or you talk to them today, tell them from 12 to 5 here in the Promise office, E102, I think it is, we're having a big event with food and getting ready for winter quarter. But we have all these services available. We have peer navigators, but then we have to get the students to go to the point about communication, to communicate back. And last time, I love Clinton's point about, he called it like generational code switching, right? He said, like, you know, you could be whatever, 40, 50, you communicate a certain way, you have certain expectations in your class, but then if a student is younger and they have a different generational way, and this goes to my point about social science and communicating, how do you get them to, like Clinton was saying last time, respect that and communicate in a way that's appropriate? And I think that is like a really good point about just stressing communication, what's considered appropriate communication, and just really emphasizing to students that it's incumbent on them to learn the professional ways of communicating. I just had a great talk with Amber the other day, our work experience coordinator, and we were having conversations about maybe rolling out some of her 21st century work skills stuff that she does with more of our students, because I think sometimes it's even more basic than, you know, they lack the foundations in math, or they're coming to a social science class being too argumentative or too biased. It's almost just like, do they even know how to communicate in a professional setting? Because if you're out with your friends, there's one way of talking, but then when you enter the workplace, the expectation is there's an appropriate way to email or talk with your manager or your coworkers. And I think maybe we could build more of that out to talk about communication. I would add in front of Kurt's word, like professional communication or academic, whatever we want to call that in a classroom setting, whether it's DE or online. So do you find, like, in either of your fields, communication is how do you get students to buy into what you expect with communicating with you in the way that you define?
What I do is I, stayed up front at the very beginning. Here is the best way to contact me. The best way is either come to my office hours or, do email. I don't do text messaging, so much. So I just, that's pretty much what I do is I state it on my syllabus. And if they have a question for me, later, it's like, did you know my office hours are so-and-so and such, or where they are? And I find that what I need to do also, as well as put it on the syllabus, is repeat it.
Yep.
Is repeat it several times. Here is the best way to contact me is this way. Because, they might have lost the syllabus, they might have not been there when I was going over it. Yeah, so just I say repetition. And I usually say, here is, this is the reason why this, doesn't work for me. It's because, I don't check my text messages except, or turn off my phone when I'm at work all day, something like that. Yeah. So, but my email is always on, so I can check that during breaks, so it would actually be quicker. So I kind of give them the why it works for me. And then I say, does that make sense to you? Does that sound reasonable? And open it up.
Open it up, yeah. I like your point about repeating, because I think in today's day and age, there's so many different forms. Oh, hi. There's what time is it? Is it 12? Class started at 1 or 5:30. Oh. Sorry for those of you in the live cast, you just got your ears knocked out here. But in terms of communication, I think the interesting thing is we're messaging, and I mentioned with the Promise program, we're using like this text messaging program with peer navigators because the realization is for younger people, that's kind of how they communicate.
That's their way.
Right? But it's important for each of us to say, I communicate this way and this way, not this way. Because they still, to go to Clinton's point, they still have to code switch up to us in terms of our expectations. And in the workplace, I always say, like, I think going along with Amber's work and work experience, maybe we need to stress a little more of what's happening in the workplace, because I feel like there's a little bit of authority there. If you're working at the casinos, and I say this having been a former in the theme park industry, service industry trainer, so certainly when we were training employees, like, we had a standard of how they had to dress, their uniform, their grooming. It was very specific. And then we had incredibly detailed seminars that we taught on communication, and we always talked about the front and the backstage. The front stage, of course, in the service arena is what the guest sees, the customer. The backstage is what employees see, and it's much different. And I think stressing just more of that expectation of what happens in the workplace as part of our methods of communication might be helpful, because I feel like students typically don't say in a work situation, oh no, I'm not going to do that, because you lose your job, you get fired, you get a warning. In a classroom setting, I've been finding more and more behavioral issues, and so I'm thinking it'll be good to build this out. I just don't know how to build it out, because we are using different methods of communication, and we all have our different styles. So I think your first point is great. Put it in the syllabus, but then you have to repeat it.
Definitely.
If they lose the syllabus or they forget or whatever. So.
I mean, they got a million things on there too. So little friendly reminder. I guess, I wrote up the syllabus and I went over this, but the point is
yeah. Damion, any tips in your field?
What I've been noticing is through email correspondence, it's really informal text. It's more text that I get from students. That's the trend I'm seeing, because it's on their phone. Yeah. And you're okay with texting? You're fine with that? I kind of have to, because in our field stuff, we're just always communicating where to be. So I mean, I have gotten oddly like texts at 1 o'clock in the morning too. Okay. Unappropriate ones. So that's becoming more of a trend. Yeah. And that's something you could put on your syllabus too. Kurt and others, if you're watching, welcome to our third person. Really advise you, if you're teaching a DE class, to state, again, like Wynn was getting at, your preferred method of communication, and then what Damion's getting at, maybe a little bit about your timing. And we don't state as a college that you have to grade on the weekend. It's your schedule as an instructor is probably as flexible as your students, but maybe just state on there, hey, if I get an email, I'll try to respond to you within 24 hours, whatever your standard is. Likewise, if you're not answering stuff on the weekends, if you do all your grading and communication with your DE class during the week, really good advice is to just state something about that. Hey, I don't communicate on Saturdays and Sundays, whatever your standard is.
Especially in the DE class, I totally agree. Yeah.
With ISP, which I know Wynn and I have had a lot of experience in ISP. Damion, have you taught?
I haven't.
You haven't taught in ISP, but ISP is a little bit different because so much of the we communicate with our students, but there's a time lag unless you're teaching in person, as Wynn does. And there's also like intermediaries. There's people in between. The students mail, they read their mail, and then there's often something through the ISP office. So communication with our ISP students goes through a lot of different layers and channels before it gets
what
back.
What I found helps too is if I see a student who's really struggling, or they're sending me an office hour request, or somehow they're really trying to reach out to help, rather than just put it through the snail mail. I often will, ask for some assistance. I'm like, Tori, can you email this to the ed coordinator and have it get to the ed, have the ed coordinator tell the student to speed things up, like if it's right before an exam or something.
Yeah, to work with that. Okay, cool. I can see this now. That's a really good point. Sometimes there are things with ISP, we sometimes don't control the communication, like the timing or speed of it. With DE, it can happen too if there is an outage with Canvas, and it's generally rare, but it could happen. Whereas with face-to-face, there's immediate communication if the student is there, and that's really nice because then you can share instructions or tips or whatever it is you would do in a face-to-face class. So as we move to DE and ISP, I think it does bring some challenges in terms of communication, I would say, for sure. And Kurt is saying on there, we're also talking, at least in the online environment, about student-student communication. So this is a really key point right now with our CBC OEI grant. 2 areas we're looking at. One is instructor presence, so to make sure you're communicating with your students and interacting and checking discussions. The state has also said, and accreditation standards have also said, that we need to make sure that students are engaging with one another. And you're definitely right, so we need to make sure, A, that the student-student communication is happening, and B, that it's appropriate. And again, using my field of social science, it may not be the case in math or wilderness, but in social science, the issue is not that students don't communicate, it's they're communicating in the wrong way, because you get someone, like you're talking about abortion, or you're talking about civil rights or something, and the students disagree about the context, and I'm always having to, and my instructors tell me the same thing in Socianthro, they have to always, reconnect or connect students, connect with them, and then sort of redirect them in some ways, because sometimes, again, they're getting too heated, and that's kind of the topic today, passions or emotions. To jump on Kurt's comment here, I would say is that, again, in social science, I want students to be passionate and to have emotions about if they're talking about something, because if they're going to achieve social change, they might be part of, future social movements or they're volunteers, that's great. But then if they're engaging with other students online or the instructor in an inappropriate manner, if they're getting too heated, I always have to step in and say, okay, I'm glad that you're excited about this topic, but can I give you some tips? And I usually do this offline, like as a personal communication or even a Skype if the student needed it, and not embarrass the student in front of everyone else, but to tell him or her, hey, can you try it this way a little bit? I know you're passionate about this subject, but can you focus on it this way a little bit?
Maybe send them an email.
Send an email or Canvas message. I remember this years ago. I taught a face-to-face class called Drugs in Society. And as you might imagine, there are a lot of people in Tahoe passionate about drugs one way or the other. And it had like 30 students, but it was really challenging. I had 2 older female students, I remember, and they were on opposite sides. One person was a marijuana advocate, and the other person was an addiction studies counselor, therapist, who believed no, you shouldn't do any drugs. You should basically be, almost straight edge and have no substances in your body. And it was always a challenge meeting and it was easier in a face-to-face class, but it was still challenging because they were so passionate and they came at it from different sides, And again, it's probably something that doesn't come up in a math class because a student's not going to say, well, I'm passionate. They could be passionate about the quadratic equation, but there isn't going to be a political side.
There's no argument.
There's not an argument. Yeah.
The answer to the quadratic equation is the quadratic equation.
Right. Yeah. I sometimes joke I wish I taught math, and I'm not good at math, but I sometimes wish that. Now English actually is not so much because English, it's the foundations, but then when you take the research paper class, the 103, they have to have a topic, and sometimes when students have those topics, that can get very political and challenging because there's passion that comes out in discussing those topics.
I can see English being a lot more like sociology than like math, because you basically have to write a paper, you have to write a thesis where you state your case and then you back it up.
Yeah. And I'm looking at Kurt thinking about teaching music, and I'm sorry about the delay for this, but I was thinking maybe in your case you deal with if you're teaching students to appreciate jazz or classical and they're inundated or they're so engaged themselves in EDM and dubstep that or hip hop or rap that sometimes again they have a foundation in music, but you have to redirect that because you want them to appreciate the different genres. The same thing comes up actually in English where maybe students are really engaged with reading particular works or pieces online, but it's not the kind of challenging literature or poetry that you want them to read in an English class. So I think, there could be those contexts where you sometimes have to redirect students where they're actually engaged with something, they're passionate about it. Wilderness could be an example where I say this being a very bad downhill skier, that one of the challenges is if you learn like an outdoor technique or a sport the wrong way, and a teacher tries to like redirect you because it's already ingrained like in muscle memory.
Oh, yeah.
And that's certainly an argument for teaching kids when they're young. But I wonder, Damion, do you deal with that where a student has learned something a particular way and you have to change it, and is there resistance because it's ingrained in them in terms of their
I can't
practice?
remember a specific incident, but it's definitely something. I've heard of stories like that where it was actually in our technical road racing class where a student had been taught one way, and then the instructor presented another way, and they got a heated argument.
Yeah.
Any kind of class, like a physical education class that required technique, I could see that, coming up. Coming up, and I mean, actually, I had the same thing happen to you. I'd been skiing, for several years, and thought I was doing just great. I could do the whole mountain, and then I wanted to learn how to ski moguls. And so basically, my technique got stripped down to level 0.
Wow.
And the same thing has happened, with lifting weights as well. I met with a personal trainer, and basically, they had me back down to like 2/3 of what I was lifting, and basically my whole technique. There were just like huge flaws. Because you can just learn to do things your own way, and it can feel right.
And it may not be right.
But you aren't having the back trouble yet, so you don't know that it's wrong. And you can lift more this way than you can the other way, or you can ski faster this way than you could the other way. So why is it wrong? That's where I could see the resistance coming. It's having to kind of go back, be willing to take steps
You think
back.
you're good, but then you have to go all the way back almost to the beginning.
Are you convinced that this is better? You have to really understand the why in order to accept it. That's what I found for myself.
Sometimes the phrase, I use the phrase like from Zen philosophy, beginner's mind, like when you take a beginner's mind to anything, hopefully then there's a little less resistance. But you have to listen to a teacher, whether it's private lessons, personal trainer, a therapist, in a classroom setting, you're taking a class even for fun and cooking, and they're telling you to do a certain way. If you resist that, like you said, if you don't respect the why behind that, and that's kind of the authority of the instructor, then you're not going to have that beginner's mind to even.
It's like you have to understand the why is like got to really sink in. It's what I found for myself.
Oh, the Zen philosophy. Sorry, Kurt. I think we have some delay here. I was saying basically there's a phrase called when Zen, a beginner's mind. And the idea is that you try to be less resistant to something that a teacher is teaching you. And you sort of take that, because Zen is often about opening your mind up and being open to the universe and not just like having all these barriers and blinders put up. So the idea in teaching would be to try to as a student to do that, to say, okay, this person is an authority in their field. I'm going to listen to them and not resist and say, no, I know better kind of thing. And we've had people in classes who have maybe done this or had a little bit of resistance, and hopefully we can show them, as Wynn is saying, the why behind things. Back to I know we skipped over the music part, and I'm trying to, let me just check the times at 12:42. 12:42, so we'll stop in a couple minutes. But Kurt, to your point about music, that's great to hear. So you have them apply musical characteristics when studying to music of their choice. So that's a great opportunity there to use their passion or their foundation in music, even if it's not the type of music you're teaching in the genre, to use that as a way to engage them in the music that you're teaching them. And I think we can all do that. You could even do that in math. I'm sure students, if you say, hey, you had experience in high school in math, and you've had experience, maybe, I don't know if students balance checkbooks anymore. That's probably a dated example, but again, it's maybe about redirecting exposure or even passion or experience with something in a new direction, hopefully with those constructive bits of advice that we can offer them as instructors, here's kind of how you approach things.
I like to go back to the growth mindset.
Yeah.
Is just taking that as the teacher yourself, is wanting to evolve.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
Techniques and views are always evolving.
Yep.
And personally, I always want to be on the forefront of it and not be stale.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, great point. Kurt's saying, I'm guessing the wilderness instructor, Damion, experiences quite a bit of passion from his students. So I guess asking, like, it sounds like you're having, in wilderness, the expectation is people are passionate because you're outdoors and it's considered fun. I mean, is there ever a hurdle that someone could be too excited to be out there and they don't listen or something?
So sometimes you'll have different experiences and abilities. And so a more experienced student will want to go outside the course curriculum and outlines that. And I'll have to just remind them that we're trying to get this course curriculum done, and if we have time, we'll come and study the topic that they wanted.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, I think we're right about there. Is it 12:44? So I think we'll bring it to a close. I appreciate there are 3 of you watching. Kurt, love your questions. I'm going to just take a screenshot of that so we can remember some of those. And thank you to Damion and Wynn for participating. Because of Thanksgiving and then finals and the long holiday break, we'll go dark until either the first or second week of January, and then we'll do another one then. So be on the lookout in your mailboxes or online with a message. And I'm confirming the room assignments for winter, but we'll be back in winter with more of these teaching talks at noon. So thank you all.